Hello, friends. It's Jessica. Welcome back to Jessie Kate Creates. As you can see, today we are jumping right in. I am making an ink blended panel, and I'm going to show you how I make that panel really stand out as the star of the show on a card. Now, since this ink blended background is the main focus for this card, I am keeping in all of the blending, and I've also kept it all real time. Nothing is sped up, so you can see the exact process I use to get my blends, and maybe I can share some tips while I go. So if you're already an ink blending professional and you don't need the extra tips, then you can go ahead and skip to the next chapter, and I will throw a timestamp up on the screen to where you can go to see the finished panel and how I turn it all into a card. But if you want some of those extra tips to help with your ink blending, let's get into it. To start things off, I have 4 inks in shades of reds and pinks. I made this card for Valentine's Day, so that was the theme. But you could make this card for any occasion by simply changing out the colors that you use or changing the sentiment on the card. And then you can use it for whatever you need it for. Birthdays, sympathy, whatever it might be. So my inks today all happen to be Concord and Ninth. They are Ballet Slipper, Honeysuckle, Poppy, and Cranberry. And I am blending onto a piece of 80-pound accent opaque white cardstock that I've cut down to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I always start with my lightest color. In this case, that was Ballet Slipper, which is a really pretty kind of soft pale pink. And I took the Ballet Slipper much further down on the page than where I actually needed it to be. And that was for multiple reasons. First, blending further down gives you more wiggle room to get a really good blend between your 2 colors. As you can see here now with the honeysuckle, I'm using a nice light hand and blending that color up into the Ballet Slipper so that there'll be a really good transition between those 2 colors. But the other reason I like to put the color in a kind of a bigger swath on the page than where it needs to be, especially with light colors, is it is very easy for a light color to get eaten up by the darker color. So I like to make sure I have plenty of wiggle room so that even if some of that Ballet Slipper does kind of get overtaken by the honeysuckle, there'll still be enough of it to show and to give me a really good transition. And you can see I did the same thing with the honeysuckle. I blended it much further down the page than I need it to be, see much further than that halfway point. So I have a lot of room to get some overlap and a good transition. Now, the next tip I have for you, and you may have noticed it with my other ink pads, you're definitely going to notice it in a second here when I move on to Poppy, is you want to use juicy ink pads. That is going to make such a big difference. You might be able to see on Poppy right now how in the middle of the ink pad it has like that really dark section. That's because I had recently re-inked it. And it was actually a lot juicier than I thought it was, so I got maybe a little bit too much on the page. But that's fine because we can always go back, and I'm going to show you kind of how I make that work, because you can see here Poppy, it's overtaking honeysuckle, but we're going to fix that in just a few minutes. But using a juicy ink pad makes it so much easier to get the ink down, and it cuts out the struggle of like, when you use a dry ink pad and you feel like you're blending for eternity, but you're not really getting that much output on the page and you start to get frustrated and then it's not fun anymore. You can avoid all that by just making sure that you have really juicy ink pads when you are doing the blending process. And again, here you can see I took that Poppy way further down on the page than it needed to be, but that's going to give me some space to have a really good transition with this cranberry color. Now, this is the only ink pad that I had not re-inked before I started blending, and so it does take me longer, and I do have a more difficult time with it, so I kind of wish I had re-inked it. But that's okay. In the end, we're still able to make it work. And you might notice here I just put down a white piece of scrap paper onto my panel, and that's because I don't want to get fingerprints on my panel. I've spent a lot of time making this blended panel, and I don't want to ruin it by getting a bright red thumbprint right in the middle of the pink on the card. So I just use a piece of scrap paper to protect my background as I'm working. I've also seen other people use like sticky notes or post-it tape. Use whatever works for you. I just had some scrap white paper on hand, so that's what I used and it worked fine. And it's going to help me prevent me from getting those unwanted fingerprints on my project. So now that I've gotten one layer down on my card, I'm actually going to go back and blend again over top of each section. I like to do this because it makes the colors really pop. It fills in any places I missed, and this helps me to really get that smooth blend between each color. When I'm blending, the first time I was really focused about getting the ink on the page in the areas I wanted it. This time I'm going to be more concerned with making sure that there is a good transition between all of my colors. So this honeysuckle section, like I mentioned before, it kind of got eaten up by the poppy when I was doing that section. So now I get to come back in with my honeysuckle and I can make sure that it's more prominent on the card and that it has a much better blend between the pink and red that it is kind of sandwiched between. And you can see here now you're starting to be able to really see that bright pink of the honeysuckle on the cardigan, whereas before it had gotten eaten up by the red. Something else to keep in mind when you're ink blending is that this is, I guess it's a little bit of a time consuming process. It's not something you can sit down and get done in 1 minute. It is going to take a little bit of time. I think in total it took me maybe 8 minutes to do this entire panel. And I'm okay with that. I just kind of turn on some music and zen out while I do my blending. But I think going into it knowing that it is going to take a little bit of time and you're going to have to be patient, having that expectation, I think, makes it a little easier than when you see something in a video and it takes the person like 30 seconds because it's edited and sped up, and then you do it and it takes so much longer and you're thinking, am I doing this wrong? Should I be able to do it faster? No, it just takes a little bit of time. So just be aware of that when you're doing your blending. Now here I've gone back to the ballet slipper. I just wanted that pink to be a little bit more prominent. And that's all this part is. It's kind of like just color correcting. Going in and saying, oh, I need more of this color here. I need a little bit more of this there. Just to make it so that everything is exactly how you want it and exactly where you want it to be on your card so that you're happy with it when it's done. I think that is especially important for this card that I'm making because I'm not really going to be covering up that much of the ink blending. What you see when I finish this panel is what's going to be on the card, so I want to make sure it's good because there's not going to be room to hide mistakes that I make on my panel. So this is a situation where I do think it's worth it to take the time to get a really great blend. Now, there are some other techniques that use ink blending where I don't have to worry about that as much because I know it's going to get covered up. But when you're doing something that is going to be prominently featured on a card, then I do think it's worth the time to make it something that you are happy with, whatever that means for you, which is why I took so much time and I keep going back in between the colors to get my blending to be perfect and exactly how I want it to be to make a card that I'm happy with. All right, so I think that's all of the blending. At this point, I'm a lot happier with the card. In person, you can see the honeysuckle on the card, I think, a lot better than what the camera is picking up. But this is the final background, and I'm super happy with how this turned out. So let's move on to the next step. I want this background to have a 1/4 inch border when I add it to the final card. So I'm just trimming 1/8 of an inch off of each side of the panel so that it measures 4 by 5 1/4. And I think this looks great, but I really want to take this to the next level by adding a ton of sparkle. So I have this DIY sparkly mica spray. This is just water and perfect pearls mixed together in a spray bottle, and I always have this on my desk. I also have my heat gun getting nice and hot off to the side. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm bringing in my splat box, which is just a shoebox lined with scrap paper. So I'm shaking up the mica spray really well, and then I'm going to spray it just like 2 or 3 times. I want a very fine mist. I don't want any droplets. And now I'm using my heat gun to go ahead and dry that and heat it up so my paper doesn't warp. and you're gonna see it leaves just the lightest bit of sparkle on the card. I want a lot more sparkle than this, so I'm going to keep doing this process where I spray 2 or 3 times and then hit it with the heat gun. And this is going to prevent my paper from warping, and it's also going to keep me from getting splotches on the card. So I did that probably 3 or 4 times, and this is what the final card looks like, super sparkly. I just cut out all of that spraying because the video was starting to get a little bit long. So the next thing I want to do to this panel is add some embossing to really up the interest. So I have the Simon Says Stamp Refracted Embossing folder. It is a 3D embossing folder, so it has a lot of really deep grooves in it. So before I run this through the folder, I'm going to spray the back with some water. The point of this is just to loosen the fibers of the cardstock a little bit so it will take the pattern of the embossing folder without cracking the paper. So you can see I just sprayed the back lightly, and I sprayed it on the back because I don't want to mess up the ink blending we have on the front of the card. And I'm going to take my time to get this positioned correctly in my folder. This card is really simple, so I want to take my time getting everything placed because if the pattern is crooked, you're going to notice it. So once I run this through the embossing folder, you're going to see we have this beautiful pattern now and no cracking because we sprayed the back of the paper. And one thing I really like about this is all of those grooves in the paper catch the light and it makes it so much easier to see the sparkle. I wish you guys could see it in person. So now it's time to move on to the sentiment for this card. For that, I'm using this Concord and 9th All the Love die set. There's a stamp set too, but I'm just using the dies. And there are 2 that are really cute, dainty, scripty dies that cut out Love You. So I'm taping those down to a scrap of 100-pound accent opaque cardstock. And I'm going to run those through my Cuttlebug machine. And you're going to see here in a second, they are so cute when they're die cut. I just love them. And I cut out 3 sets of these because I want to stack these up together so that I have some dimension on my card. But for the top layer, I thought it would be really fun to use like white glossy cardstock, but I don't own any. So I looked through my stash to see what I had that I could make work, and I found this glossy photo paper. I use this for ink blending sometimes, and I thought this would be a potentially really good substitute. I've never die cut from it before, so I wasn't sure how well it would work. But I ran it through my Cuttlebug machine, and y'all, it cut out like butter. Absolutely beautiful, as you can see here. I love how that turned out. So now that I have all of my pieces, it's time to glue them together and stack them up. I zoomed in really close for this so you can see how I do it. I like to use a wet glue for this step, but if you have a Xyron sticker machine, you could totally use that. Or if you have like sticky micro dots, I know some companies have those now, you could use that too. I just don't have any of those. I have wet glue and it's what I like to use. So you can see I'm just putting tiny little dots all over my die cut, and I highly recommend using a fine tipped glue bottle for this. Then I'm going to take another layer and I'm going to position that right on top. And I'm going to use my fingers and my fingertips to wiggle these in place and kind of get everything aligned exactly how I want it. This step is kind of finicky, so if this style of card making isn't for you, that's totally fine. You can skip layering up your die cuts. I just like to do it because I don't mind how finicky it is and I like the way it looks on a card, but please feel free to skip this step if it's just not something that's for you. So once I have these lined up, I'm going to set them under a heavy block and move on to working on the U sentiment. That way the layers have a little bit of time to just like adhere before I keep adding more. And I just keep doing this, adding the glue, stacking them up, and going back and forth until I have everything stacked up. And of course, the glossy photo paper is the final layer, and I love the way this looks. I think it's going to be so cute on the card. So now that all of the elements are ready, it's time to put this card together. So I just have a white side folding A2 card base that measures 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And right now I am just like practicing or auditioning my card to make sure I know how I want everything placed. I do this for most of my cards, but I think it's really important to do with really kind of clean, simple cards because when you're doing cards like that, the mistakes show more. They're a little bit harder to cover up. So I like to make sure I know exactly what I'm doing before I start assembling the cards. You can see there, I tried the sentiment in the lower right corner, then I tried it in the middle, but I liked it in the lower right corner, so that's what I'm sticking with. So I've taken my background and I want to pop this up on my card. So I am just covering the back of this with some foam tape. I also like doing this for 3D embossed panels because it's just easier than trying to put wet glue all over the back of that. So I completely cover the panel with my foam tape, and then I'm gonna position it on the card one more time just so I know how I'm putting it down. For some reason, this helps me when I am eyeballing putting down panels with foam on them. So I'm going to peel the backer off that foam tape, and then I'm going to use my insurance policy, which is wet glue. Because with this foam tape, once it touches the cardstock, it is not going to budge. I'm not going to be able to move it. So I put wet glue all over the back, and that provides me with a little bit of wiggle room when I am placing foam down onto my project, which you can see here I needed because she was struggling a little to get this lined up on the card. So I really needed that insurance policy so I could wiggle this around and get it exactly how I wanted it on the card. But once I finally get that bit figured out, I'm going to go ahead and stick that down, and then it's time to add on the sentiment. Now for this, again, I am going to use wet glue so I have some wiggle room. Also, this is going down on top of a bumpy surface, so I wanted to use the wet glue to make sure that everything gets stuck and well adhered. So I positioned the sentiment how I wanted it to be on the card. I picked up one word with tweezers, covered the back with tiny little dots of glue, and then put it back down exactly where I wanted it to be. Positioning it and then gluing it made it a little bit easier for me to make sure I was getting things exactly where I wanted them instead of just kind of guessing. So that's why I chose to do it this way. Oh, and I am putting down an acrylic block there just again to make sure that the glue stays pressed down to that bumpy surface. Put glue all over the back of the love word, and then I'm going to stick that down in exactly the same way. And then I'm going to cover this with blocks and set it to the side to dry. Now at this point is when I realized I need an inside for my card. So I took a piece of lightweight cardstock. I think this is only around like 60-ish pounds. And I decided I'd just do some ink blending on this panel for the inside. Now, if I had thought ahead when I was planning out this card, I could have done this step when I had all of my inks out. So instead, I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to use whatever residual ink is still on my blending tools, and that's going to be good enough. So I'm just adding a little bit of all those colors down to the bottom left corner of this panel. And then I decided I wanted to do something else still. So I took some of the scrap of the glossy photo paper that I used for the sentiment, and I just punched out a heart, and I'm just going to glue that down in the corner as well. So there's that glossy heart on the bottom inside corner. And I thought that was just a really kind of fun, cute way to tie the front of the card to the inside of the card. I like to decorate the inside of my cards because I think it just kind of, I don't know, it adds to the experience of opening or receiving a card. I think it just makes it a little bit extra fun. So that's why I like to do that to my cards. All right, so now that that panel is done, I'm just going to go ahead and glue that to the inside of the card. And that is mostly going to complete the card, although you are going to see I decided at this point to, you know what, let's make a matching envelope for the card. I don't always do that, but sometimes I do, and I really enjoy it. So this is a pink envelope that I picked up at a stationery shop when I was traveling. I don't remember where I got it from, just a pink envelope. And I decided to keep things really simple. I was just going to stamp down a heart on this card. So I'm going to the Concord and Ninth All the Love stamp set and just pulling out a heart. You could use a heart from any stamp set you own, guys. And I'm just going to stamp, oh, I thought about adding a little love you to it as well, but then I was like, well, the card already says love you. So we'll just stick with the heart. And I decided to use the Poppy ink from Concord and Ninth because one, I used it on the front of the card, and two, I thought this ink would really stand out well on this pink envelope. So I'm just going to stamp that down, and you're going to notice I keep this stamp down for like 5 seconds. When I'm not using my MISTI, when I'm hand stamping, I like to make sure I press down for a few seconds so that all the ink transfers because I'm really bad at double stamping by hand. So there you have it. That completes the envelope. It is super simple, but I think it's really cute with this card. I'm so happy with how this project turned out. I love that the ink blending really is the feature on this card. We added some sparkle and some embossing to really make things pop. The ink blending really is the star of the show for this card. I hope you enjoyed this video and there were some useful tips in it for you, and I hope it inspires you to go create an ink blended project in your craft room. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see all the projects I make. Hit the notification bell so you always get notified when I post a new video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in another video soon. Bye!